I'm thrilled to say that I'm joined by Lieutenant General Thomas Spoehr, Director of National Defence at Heritage Foundation, a think tank in Washington, D.C. As we continue our US election coverage, we're going to focus on some of the defence implications that might result from either a new presidency or a second term for Donald Trump. Lieutenant General, thanks very much for joining us, and you're very welcome to Shepherd Media Weekly Defence Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth mentioning that as we're recording, there's still no conclusion, and we're still none the wiser as to who might be the next president of the United States, or if indeed Donald Trump will be given a second term. But with that said, and if we look into the possibilities of both those potential scenarios, what would you say are the main differences that come to mind when we think about defense policy of the Republicans and the Democrats?
Yeah, so thanks again. I think there are a lot of similarities, and we can talk about those. The main differences, I would say, is there is a lot less enthusiasm in the Democratic Party in a Biden administration for growing the defense budget. And so they have, in the last two Congresses, they put forward proposals to cut the defense budget, one by 10%, which is a lot of money. Defense budget, U.S. defense budget's around $700 billion. And so a 10% cut, while it doesn't sound that big, that'd be $70 billion. And so that'd be a fairly significant cut. A couple other areas kind of where they're very different, and that's in nuclear modernization. The U.S. nuclear deterrent has essentially gone unmodernized for about 20 or so years. And so it's all the legs of the nuclear deterrent, the sea leg, the land leg, the air leg, bombers, subs, ICBMs are all kind of due for modernization. And the Biden administration is a lot more skeptical about the need to do that. And so they would potentially go slower. They've talked about trying to forego one of the legs of the nuclear triad, like the ICBMs. Another area where there'll be a lot of differences is in policy difference. And so the Trump administration has put in place a policy about service by transgender individuals. Vice President Biden has kind of said that on day one he would overturn such a policy. So there's a lot of areas where they differ. Some areas where they're fairly similar is both President Trump and Biden are kind of skeptical about overseas commitments of U.S. forces, which is kind of significant, is that they both kind of share that view.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned then, the possibility of funding cuts if indeed Joe Biden is elected. I mean, where might the axe fall then, aside from the nuclear deterrent issue that you've mentioned and raised? I mean, across our land and sea, where might the axe fall on big programs in particular?
Yeah, and so there's been some discussion among people that were in the previous, in the Obama administration, about maybe cutting the size of the U.S. Army. The Army it's at around 485,000 active duty soldiers right now. Some people that, for example, Michelle Flournoy, who's, talked about as being a potential defense secretary in a Biden administration, have talked about shrinking the Army because there's less need, if you're in a conflict with China, to have a large Army. So they've talked about that. Obviously, the nuclear deterrent is one. Some discussion about, do we need as big a Navy as the Trump administration has projected? The Trump administration recently talked about growing the Navy up to 500 ships by the year 2045. Some, like Hillary Clinton and others, Adam Smith, the current chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, have questioned that number. So I think there are some areas where cuts could happen. And then just in conventional fighting systems like tanks and aircraft carriers and jet fighters like the F-35, I think the Biden administration would be a little more reluctant to buy those in the quantities that the Trump administration has projected.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on that topic then, I mean, industry would presumably be fairly nervous then about Biden administration if the reading on this is that there are potential cuts to come, and that the Democrat Party in general are at least sticking to the levels of funding that have gone ahead under Trump. What would the sense from industry be on then the next 4 years if the country is to be led by Biden?
Yeah, it's a great question. Most of the major U.S. defense industries just had their third quarter earnings call where they talk about their forecast and how they did for the year. And they've all essentially put a good face on it. So none of them are projecting gloom and doom under a Biden, and because they were all asked, how do things look under Biden? And they have said, not so bad. We're not terribly pessimistic. I think that's their public face. I think in private, if they were asked, they'd be relatively concerned about a Biden administration and where it would go in the defense industry. There is a normal moderating factor, and that is jobs and industry. And so, especially in areas like the shipbuilding industry, there's the Biden administration would be somewhat moderated by the impact that these shipyards that are sprinkled on both of the coasts generate a lot of industrial jobs, and people are, traditionally very reluctant to cut industry manufacturing type of jobs. And not only just the shipyards themselves, but the secondary producers, the companies that make propellers and engines and all those kinds of various things that go into ships, throughout the heartland of the United States. Again, that acts as a moderating impulse on people that would say, hey, we need to cut ships or planes, that type of thing, because those immediately translate to jobs, and Democrats are just as sensitive to the allegation that they have cut U.S. industrial manufacturing jobs. Nobody wants to be accused of that.
And if we move the conversation slightly to